My name is Alexia Hernandez. I am a Texas A&M student in College Station, Texas, studying international studies, politics, and diplomacy. I am also had worked on the Lucy McBath for Congress campaign under the Georgia Democrats for the 2020 general congressional election for the 6th congressional district. So I was a field organizer on that campaign. It was my first field organizing job, and I'm really happy to be here.
Great. Thank you so much. I just wanted to sort of start with get an overview of your childhood. What sort of in your childhood pushed you to go into politics and then going to organizing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been interested in politics since probably a young preteen or around that time, around 2012, 2013. At that time, I really didn't know much about politics. It was a really daunting and complicated process for me, seeing all this House and Senate, and I had no idea what was going on. But what I did see was my parents who worked really, really hard to provide me a good childhood and to provide me everything I needed to succeed. Um, Growing up, my parents worked really hard. They worked in a lot of different jobs. Employment wasn't really guaranteed for both of them, so they kind of took whatever they could get. And so a lot of the times we would be insecure about healthcare. Sometimes we'd be insecure about where the money was coming from, or maybe looking at the differences of the quality of education depending on where we lived in the city. These were all things that made me realize that getting involved really does make a difference in lives like mine, lives like my parents, and lives of everyone around me living in Houston and just growing up all together.
Absolutely. And did you have any, role models as a kid that you sort of, looked up to, and then of course, drove you to go study what you're studying in college, and then of course, go out and do your organizing in Georgia that you just mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I talked about my parents before, but they're definitely my biggest role models. The reason being is my mother had me at 18, was a teen mom and didn't have a formal education past high school, or any work experience. And so she worked really, really hard to provide for me. And seeing her have a limited support system when I was younger really pushed me to work very hard in school, because if my mom could do it with the kid, at that same age, then I, for one, can definitely do it as well. My father, as well, he has worked really, really hard to get to where he was. Due to his occupation, he gets laid off a lot. And so sometimes has to jump from job to job. And so, um, seeing him, persevere through all of that, persevere through financial struggles and not knowing where his next check will come from a lot of the time. I would say my parents have been my biggest role models, have been my biggest supporters, and I strive every day to make them proud.
And you sort of mentioned before that your most recent job was that in Georgia and being an organizer. Was that actually your first foray into sort of politics, at least in a job sense and organizing, or did you have something that maybe you did before that?
Yeah, so this was actually my first organizing job. Um, and I'll talk about this a little later when it comes up. But when you have experience in other industries, like the service industry, especially the service industry, customer service, dealing with people, a lot of that translates into organizing. And so I had a ton of customer service experience from high school and in college. And so that really translated to my first field organizing job. But yeah, just to answer your question, this was my first formal role in political organizing.
Mhm. And you sort of teed it up a little bit for us, but could you take me a little bit, just through as an organizer, what is your schedule, right? What do you do, right after you wake up? Sort of what do you do as an organizer?
Yeah, so it's going to look a little different, of course, because of COVID. But the objectives and the baseline of what you're actually doing and your purpose is a lot of the same thing. So when I wake up and when I get ready, of course, and log on, if it's remote, I'll check my emails, make sure there's nothing to check there. I'll usually attend a check-in call. And so what that entails is all of the field organizers, all the staff every morning will meet and just kind of go over the day's objectives, answer any questions. Sometimes there's some really important updates. In a campaign job, there's a lot of fast moving pieces. And so literally in the span of hours, there can be something completely different that's happening. And so it's really important to have these check-in calls in the morning. And then I would probably say start making calls to voters, start doing voter outreach. And so that was a huge part of my job. I contacted hundreds of voters a day. And in the beginning, it was really, really daunting. But over time, you develop confidence and you know what you're doing. You believe in what you're talking about. And so you reach out to voters, convince them to go and cast their vote, make a voting plan with them, answer any questions that they have about voting, or maybe kind of swing them towards one direction or the other about the candidate of choice. And then also big part of my job was volunteer management. So a lot of that had to do with training volunteers on how to contact voters, or anything else otherwise, or volunteer recruitment. I spent a big deal of my day doing volunteer recruitment, calling volunteers or people who we thought would be huge supporters of our candidate, and then going out and recruiting them to do events with us or to help us get out the word when it came to getting more voters into our fold. And in the evening, we would also have a lot of events with the Congresswoman. And so, most recently in my last job, it would be Congresswoman Lucy McBath. And so we had a lot of we had a lot of events in the evening. Of course, they're virtual because of COVID. Um, but we would have different events to engage with voters, engage with volunteers, engage with different groups and constituents in our area. But all in all, a lot of it is just voter outreach, engaging with the community, and also getting more volunteers to help our candidate get elected.
And you sort of touched on this a little bit, COVID or not COVID related, take this question however you really want to go with it. What are some of the obstacles as an organizer that you sort of face trying to go about your job?
Yeah, definitely as an organizer, I'm 20 years old, and so I'm not very old. I'm still in college, and this was my first organizing job. And so 2020 was a year where you're kind of thrown into the fire. Everyone is hitting the ground running. It was very competitive this year, especially in the 6th congressional district, and so of Georgia. So we had a lot of obstacles. I think I personally had a lot of obstacles, but I think I overcame a lot of them. For example, some obstacles were some apathetic voters. You call voters, a lot of them are really jaded with the system or feel like the system and their government and their elected officials has let them down, understandably so. And so you're a complete stranger trying to convince people to vote a certain way when they don't know anything about you. You have to build trust with them over the phone in a span of maybe 30 seconds, or they'll hang up or they'll tell you to, go somewhere else. And so it's really difficult to build that trust with constituents, just especially if you're not in person with them, over the phone where they can't see your face, when they don't realize you're a person. But over time you kind of, at least I developed a communication style that was warm and inviting and understanding, really listening to them, I think is the key. Another really common obstacle that I think a lot of field organizers faced in 2020 specifically was volunteer recruitment. Because everything went digital, a lot of people are a little bit disengaged because things are not in person. We can't do block walking. We can't, knock on doors. We can't actually talk to people face to face at events like, festivals or things of that sort. And so, um, it's very, very difficult to engage people online. And it's very difficult to ask people to, volunteer from home and when they don't have that support system to help them with technology or any questions or things like that. And so we tried our best, with Zoom, and having office hours where people could hop in to our Zoom room for the campaign and ask any questions they had. But all in all, it's very, very difficult to get people engaged in the digital world. And hopefully, as the situation in the world with COVID gets better, I'm hoping for the next election cycle, at least for the congressional races, will be a lot easier in engaging people as well.
Absolutely. And again, sort of touching back on those obstacles maybe a little bit. Could you talk about maybe some of the stressors that are related to your job and then how you end up dealing with them?
Yeah, so there are a lot of stressors with the job if you don't get your life together and you don't organize everything. I was a student while doing my job, and so even more so, I had to be organized whether I liked it or not. Definitely one of the biggest stressors was time management. Learning how to manage time, especially in a role where I have never held a full time job before. And so learning to manage, how to get all of my tasks done at the end of the day. One of the biggest tools I always recommend is keeping an online calendar or a planner if that makes someone feel better writing it down physically. I like online because I can look at my calendar on my computer and I can look at it on my phone if I'm on the go. And knowing everything I'm going to do that day and what times and what I need to prepare and things like that really, really help me navigate through that time management. Literally documenting every single thing I'm going to do that day. That way, don't get off track. I don't get lost in what I'm doing. I know exactly what's next. Um, I think that's probably the biggest challenge, and also. Um, Talking and cold calling voters is really nerve wracking. It's super, super nerve wracking if you've never called people before in that sense. At least the first few days are very, very nervous. You're calling people, you're stuttering over the phone. You don't really know the script very well. You don't know these people really well, and you're trying to convince them to vote for a candidate in a very politically charged year. But I think just kind of keeping the big picture, talking to my coworkers and my fellow field organizers and my field director, and always keeping the big picture about what we're doing and why it matters. And that we are truly helping people and that our candidate really is for the people. And just keeping that big picture in mind really helped me get through a lot of those maybe uncomfortable calls or those uncomfortable conversations, knowing that at the end of the day, the big picture is what matters.
Absolutely. And, again, it's sort of touching on everything as we move on through the questions, but could you sort of chronicle for me the highest that you felt and the best that you felt in your job and then, that lowest point that you felt as an organizer?
Yeah, so the highest point I would probably say was when I had the opportunity to facilitate a kind of a roundtable talk or maybe a town hall of sorts with the president of NARAL pro-choice, which is super super cool. And they're with my candidate as well. Um, just seeing somebody so influential and in charge of such an influential and important organization, listening to me and responding to my questions and also engaging with constituents. In that sense, it was really really cool. I had never really put myself in that position before talking to someone that important. And so that was really awesome. I would say another moment that was a high was during the final legs of the campaign. We did some socially distanced phone calls outdoors. And the Congresswoman came by and we set her up with a Chromebook. And I was actually helping her make calls and kind of navigating her through the process of our phone system, which I think at that time we were using Hub Dialer. So how to dial constituents and kind of teaching her how to use Outvote, which was our texting platform. Just physically being there, of course, social distancing with masks on, very safe and everything like that. But physically being there and helping her make these constituency calls, through the campaign as well was super, super cool. There's a couple pictures on Lucy McBath's Twitter at Lucy McBath, if anybody wants to check it out, of her making some calls to voters. So I think that was definitely some of my highest moments. My lowest moments have definitely been the times where I have encountered some voters who are very, very distrustful of anyone with the name Democrat attached to them or anything with progressiveness tied to it. When certain people hear these words tied to candidates or even staff, they are, very hostile to the idea. Um, that doesn't completely, turn me away from trying to talk to them. I'm from Texas. I grew up in conservatism and around conservatism my entire life. And so I think I know, just a little bit on how to deal with these kind of voters. And they're definitely not lost at all. I think a lot of them have some very good defining political um, moral guidelines, and a lot of them really do want what's best. But sometimes it's really tough to break through that initial, defensiveness of, hi, I'm from a state Democratic Party, please listen to me. I have some good stuff to say and actually some information that may help you. Go vote, or, may help you make your decision on a candidate. And so I think definitely the lowest points have been, dealing with those really hostile voters over the phone. But over time you get used to it, and like I said, just kind of keeping in mind the bigger picture is really, really important.
Yeah, and sort of again to revert, off the job for a little bit, and then back on to sort of the story of your own life. Is there anything that you, if you could go back and change anything, maybe to get to a better spot, or maybe if you like the spot you're in, be like, hey, I would have rather done this to get in there faster or slower, whatever it happened to be. Is there anything, if you could go back and change something that you would change, or are you, content with sort of how the path in your life has played out to this point, and where you are right now?
I would say I'm mostly content, but if I could change anything, I would definitely have canvassed with more candidates before in the primaries and things like that, in 2019, in the beginning of 2020, and definitely in 2018 as well, with those races before I got into a field organizing position. I think I managed fine. It was very difficult though, being my first field organizing job and not really having much specific voter contact experience. I've had customer service experience, but it's just a little bit different. So I wish I had gone and canvassed and volunteered my time with campaigns before I went to work on a campaign. I think that's extremely important and honestly makes the transition so much easier and gives you some expertise when going into a field organizing position. So that's something I definitely would have changed.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about sort of the fact that you're a student, and then also you are a field organizer at the same time. And do you think it's achievable to have sort of a field organizing job outside of like an all-encompassing thing that is school, or you think it's just too much on somebody's plate? If they really want to focus on field organizing, they should just sort of do it on their own and do field organizing as the sole thing they're pursuing at that point.
Yeah, so I think it totally depends on the person. I think if you're dedicated enough, if you are if you're committing yourself to being disciplined to stick to your time management and logging everything down, making sure you have time to do homework, studying extra, whatever extracurriculars you're in, but also fulfilling and exceeding your job requirements, I think it's totally possible. It was tough on me, but then again, we all my classes were online for that semester, and so I didn't have to physically go to campus. So that made it a lot easier. Now, in the long run, when there's actual physical classes to attend, when things with COVID kind of settle down, I'm not too sure. I think that's probably a lot more. Time consuming and probably a little bit tougher to deal with, but I think anything is possible. I definitely think it's completely doable, but it definitely takes a lot of self-discipline and it takes very good time management skills. And as somebody growing up who didn't really have great time management skills, I kind of, winged everything in high school. I definitely think anyone can learn it. It's never too late to just pick up on those skills. And honestly, a lot of it you learn it on the go as well. I think completely depends on the person, but I would say um you only live once, and certain opportunities come and go. And if someone deems it that they have enough time in their schedule to work in a field organizing capacity while doing school, go for it. And that also looks great to future employers, getting to say that you were working so hard on a campaign in a field organizing capacity while fulfilling your educational obligations. I think looks amazing, and is really telling on anybody's character, that they're a really hard worker and also care about multiple things at once in their life.
Absolutely. And sort of talked a little bit about, everything in your life and then the organizing portion of it. Is there any advice you would give to somebody who's maybe, trying to break into that, political organizer job, and maybe trying to, just maybe get their feet wet a little bit? And what advice maybe would you give to try to enter the field?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple of tips I would say comes to mind. Number one is I think this isn't very widely known, but field organizers and just staff in general that work with the campaign are often from different groups. And so often, most of the time, they're not all hired by the campaign themselves. A lot of them are hired through the state party. A lot of them are hired through the DCCC, which is the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And so there's all these different groups that you can get a job through and work on that campaign. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to get always the campaign that you want, but it is a really good way to get involved when you apply to different groups. So not only apply to the campaign, apply to the DCCC, apply to the state party, and also look for internships. Unfortunately, a lot of internships on campaigns are not paid. I have very strong feelings about that. I definitely think every intern should be paid, just because it gives a lot of underprivileged, students and young adults. It doesn't give them that much of a fair shot if they can't literally live on nothing. You can't pay rent with no money. And so unfortunately, a lot of these are not paid, but if you can find the time, if you're able to, a lot of them work with your schedule and it's not that many hours a week. So definitely look into those internships and those fellowships. um, and keeping in mind that customer service, restaurant working at a store, a lot of these industries, a lot of campaigns or state party or things like that will look at that and see and value that you can talk to people, that you have experience talking to people, because that's mainly what a field organizer is. You're engaging with the community. It's so communication based. And even if you're not the greatest communicator, as long as you have the will to do better and to change your communication styles and work on it, I think it's totally doable. But yeah, some of that customer service experience is extremely, extremely helpful. I would probably say get as much as you can if you cannot find any actual political organizing experience, and that is a great supplement. And if you want a better chance at landing a field organizing role, you may not be able to get one on AOC's campaign because everybody wants to be on AOC's campaign, but you may be able to get one on a smaller congressional campaign, or maybe a state house campaign, or maybe, something like that. Starting small may increase your chances because those are less competitive. But if you're able to shoot for the stars, go for it. I would say just honestly just send an application everywhere and see what sticks. Know your worth, know your value. um, you know I find that especially women and women of color, there's been studies that say that we don't apply ourselves to a lot of opportunities because we think we're underqualified. And so it's really important that people just go for it. Even if we don't meet all of the check marks of that job, they may see something really special on that interview, like your past customer service experience, or maybe your volunteer experience, or your major, may all encompass a really good employee or an intern or a fellowship for them. So I would say just shoot for everything, but also, at the end, keep your, expectations realistic. And so just try your best to establish that resume, maybe of customer service experience, maybe of canvassing with another campaign also really helps as well, as a volunteer sense. And just kind of apply for with all these different organizations, apply small, apply big, just don't limit yourself for sure.
Yeah, and thanks again for coming on. We have our last little ethereal sort of big question type of, I guess, a question, but how do you think that your job is contributing to society or really making the world a better place?
I think one of the biggest problems with American politics is that there is not enough understanding of all the different facets of the political spectrum. I think a lot of people, especially with the age of social media and a lot of misinformation, there seems to be a lot of echo chambers or a lot of misinformation or different sides being misconstrued. And think that the role of a field organizer helps combat this, and that you're physically talking to voters and getting them engaged in the political process. Maybe they may not be for your candidate, but hey, you had a conversation with them about the politics that affect their life, and that might be something that may affect them in the future if they ever do want to get involved. You may, of course, the big picture is electing candidates that do fight for the people. And so, depending on what candidate gets elected to whatever position, there are tangible changes that happen for that community when it comes to funding, when it comes to legislation, laws, reform, things like that. I think my role is, it is a smaller role in the sense of a campaign, but we are the face of the campaign. And so, in that sense, our role is extremely important. I value it very highly. And I say me alone, I'm alone, I'm not changing society, but all of my other field organizers and people in field all coming together and um, you know, mobilizing people to make a difference and go vote and get involved in their communities. I think that's amazing. I think local organizing is some of the best things that you can do to make change. And so I think I am hopefully contributing to society. I would say so. I think my candidate was pretty great. And I definitely hope to do more organizing in the future, whether it be for candidates or single issue, legislation or things like that. But in the grand scheme of things, I would say it's not me individually who changes it, but it's all of us who take that time and that commitment to organize to fight for a better future.
Absolutely. Thank you again so much for coming on.